For those tuned in to live stream, hello, and to those here in the room, greetings. I'm Bill Hosley, and Jeff Partridge and I, he's the director and founder of the Hartford Heritage Project at Capital Community College. We started this lecture series 5 years ago, and I'm still kind of amazed that given the pandemic and everything, we managed to pull it off every year, and it's getting better. And I think each iteration improves. And this year, to my actual astonishment, we have 7 activities. And this is the last of some of the years the lecture series has been 4 or 5 parts. This year it's 3, but we're doing 2 tours, and we had an exhibit opening at Capitol, which if you haven't seen the exhibit there on Black Encounters, formation of the Black community in Hartford, it's really very well done. It's really very interesting, I'm old enough that when I got into this business of museums and preservation, there was no literature on Black history, almost none. And in terms of art history, nobody really, I'm sure there was folk knowledge, but books had not really yet been written. And one of my great, something I'm very proud of having been involved with in the 1980s and early 90s, I was involved in the restoration of Hartford's ancient burying ground, and it was there that Billy Anthony, a teacher in the Bloomfield schools, developed this incredible momentum about studying, how many people of African descent lived in Hartford in the period of the ancient burying ground. Who were they? What did they do? Where did they come from? All those questions. Scholarship and history are something that is man-made. We make it, and we make it by doing it. And sometimes there are a great many questions in life and in the world and in our world that have not been addressed. So scholarship is always an important part of it. And this year, for a variety of reasons, we're focusing on Hartford's Black history. Not entirely. I mean, I opened the series by setting the stage with this argument about the religious community here and how the leaders of the Second Great Awakening kind of paved the road for a more open, inclusive society, and certainly for the anti-slavery efforts that took off here in the 1840s and 50s before the Civil War. But there's so much more to learn and so much more to do. So excited about that. And tonight's speaker is Antoinette Brimbell, who is the Connecticut Poet Laureate. And as a writer, I should add that all of the elements of this series have dealt with people expressing themselves and finding inclusion and independence and validation through writing. And it's interesting that we learned last week that James Pennington wrote the first history of the Negro people, as it was described, published in America in the 1840s, and he was a minister here. And Antoinette Brimbell, again, is the author of various poetry collections. Her poetry has appeared in many journals, magazines, textbooks, and anthologies. She is also a printmaker and collage artist who exhibits in New Haven, where she is the past president of the Creative Arts Workshop. I worked in New Haven for a number of years. I know that organization well. Television, radio, she interviewed a variety of entertainers, literary figures, political pundits, community developers, and, oh, by the way, is a professor of English at Capital Community College and a friend of the Hartford Heritage Project. So all I will say in conclusion is that from today, which is Thursday, the last 2 programs in the series are Saturday mornings. The website, if you have any questions, we can address those. Steve Thornton will be doing a tour leaving from the front of the old State House here at 10 a.m. on Saturday the 15th, and then on the 22nd, Dr. Fiona Vernal is going to be leading an encounters session, which is a discussion of the legacy of the Talcott Church here at the old State House at 10 a.m. And then finally on October 29th, I'm involved in this library and archives tour at Center Church. It is the greatest underknown public collection in the state of Connecticut. Anyone that turns out, their minds will be blown by what is there. So without another note, here's Antoinette Brimpel. Thank you.
So I want to start out by saying thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I want to say thank you to my Capital Community College colleagues and friends who are online, to everyone in the audience and everyone who is following us on Facebook and on YouTube. And I think I'm ready for my slides, please. Awesome. So I have entitled this paper, Stranger in a Strange Land, Ann Plato's Strategy for Autonomy, as evidenced in essays, including biographies and miscellaneous pieces in prose and poetry. In 1841, Ann Plato becomes the first African American writer to publish a collection of essays. However, when scrutinized through a white canonical literary lens or juxtaposed with more accepted African American authors, her work is generally criticized for being derivative and of little literary merit, rendering Plato a footnote in history. However, if the reader considers Ann Plato a type of social engineer, one who understands the management of human beings in accordance with their place and function in society, Ann Plato's publication of essays can be read as a treatise that establishes an identity by which she protects herself physically and socioeconomically, thereby ensuring personal autonomy and optimizing her opportunity for social and physical mobility. Born into vulnerable circumstance, Plato understands that the acquisition of education is necessary for even a modicum of social safety, and so she pursues education tenaciously. And then Plato assimilates into the social mores of Hartford society by demurely dissuading association with the displaced and disappearing indigenous. Instead, she seeks asylum in the colored Congregational Church, compelling the influential Reverend Dr. James W.C. Pennington to attest to her virtue and subsequent value to the larger community. In essays, Plato's pious discourse assures the reader that her quiet and pleasant demeanor demands nothing. Instead, she only wishes to serve her community by emulating Christian examples, educating herself prudently, and inspiring young women of color to do the same. With literary allusions and echoes, she demonstrates the breadth of her education and comprehension of complex ideas and postulates. Her diction and syntax, far advanced for her station, expresses a dexterity with language, becoming of an aspiring educator. Consequently, Plato secures a teaching position, and through her industry, she cares for herself. Ultimately, it would seem she is able to pass through Hartford, safely securing herself within a new identity construct. There we go. Ann Plato's Hartford was not particularly welcoming to those born Black, Native, and female. African-American scholar Dr. Kenny J. Williams writes, Hartford, a prominent New England city in the 1840s, though nominally committed to freedom, was marked by its restricted freedoms. Williams makes a note of the patriarchal power structure privileged by law, which left women disempowered and at the mercy of male heads who may or may not have been benevolent. Williams continues, unless members of relatively affluent households, children were put to work early. Hence, few children were able to attend school with any degree of regularity. Thus, an educated woman was a rarity. Additionally, in his book, Hartford's Ann Plato and Native Borders of Identity, Dr. Wellborn establishes a link between Plato's Hartford and the ancestral lands of the Sukiyag, who were massacred and whose remnant became extinct. If freedom is existence, Connecticut's indigenous tribes were imperiled twofold. In her poem, The Natives of America, Plato laments this reality herself, writing in her father's voice, alas, it was a cruel day. We were crushed. Into the dark, dark woods we rushed to seek a refuge. My daughter, we are now diminished, unknown. Furthermore, though Connecticut abolished slavery via the 1784 Act of Gradual Abolition, slavery was still practiced in Connecticut until 1848. Both enslaved and indentured servants of African and Native descent served many of our community's founding families and everyday folks. Though Ann Plato was a free woman, she and others were not wholly safe from racially motivated acts of violence. I have to find where I was. As evidenced by the three-day anti-Black riot in Hartford in June of 1835. According to Beeching's Hopes and Expectations, all Black people were aware of a fixed division based on skin color. It was into this milieu that Ann Plato was born. If explication and juxtaposition of the narrative Little Harriet and the poem The Natives of America are indications of Plato's familial condition, this is a girl under existential threat. If Anne is in fact Harriet, she is mothered by an intemperate, worthless woman given to strong drink who disowns her when she is wrongfully fired by her employer, thus becoming homeless. As Wellborn writes, Plato's Indian father left for other environs. Effectively, the child is orphaned. Perhaps lamenting this in her essay, Obedience, Plato muses, the greatest loss that can befall a child is to be deprived of pious and affectionate parents. The turning point in Little Harriet's life is not only in part due to fortune, but relies heavily on her resourcefulness and good character. Wellborn summarizes, wandering the streets, Harriet encounters a Mrs. Jewell who befriends her because she needs a young girl for domestic help. Though Mrs. Jewell's action is not entirely altruistic, the young heroine, having been rescued from the streets, is offered and avails herself of education and religious training. It is important to note that though scholars suspect Little Harriet is biographical, Plato has chosen to present her circumstances allegorically. Subsequently, the story evidences the accepted social mores of the time, which she later explains in essays, primarily the necessity of strong parenting and the piety of Christians who bestow benevolence on the lesser among them. Plato admonishes those receiving such acts of charity to accept them graciously by working hard and making themselves worthy through industry. Additionally, by fictionalizing the allegory, she keeps in good taste by keeping her more sordid family business to herself, as a lady of the time would. Though it cannot be known how Plato inwardly identified, whether she saw herself as native, Black, or she held some notion of biracialism, Plato's discourse suggests a duality in her judgment of the indigenous way of life, its sustainability, and its religious implications. In her poem, The Residence of My Father, Plato paints a perfect pastoral scene of a home that the poem's speakers refer to as her own. How pleasantly my home does stand. The scenery round is all but grand. The noise is lulled by a rippling stream. There are the rays of sunshine gleam. The poem continues in this manner, lulling the reader into a quieted state. However, the first line of the second stanza, "Delightful garden, now art thou," foreshadows the volta or turn that begins the fourth stanza and culminates in the final stanza. The poet invokes the Garden of Eden early in the poem, and in doing so asks the reader to hold in their mind the two landscapes side by side, characterizing the unscarred indigenous landscape as a type of Eden on earth. However, this allusion comes packed with a bitter backstory. It suggests that the father's landscape will be mishandled by careless humans, thus resulting in a type of Adamic fall for both its inhabitants and for the landscape. The reader might then surmise that the indigenous way of life is terminable and therefore unsustainable. Subsequently, the poem's fourth stanza serves as a benediction, and the final stanza is a virtual hail and farewell. Though it is not always advisable to conflate the poem's author with the poem's speaker, given what is known of Ann Plato, one might feel compelled to do just that. The poem Residence of My Father might suggest a reason for dissuading association with the displaced and disappearing indigenous and associating herself with the colored Congregational Church, seemingly choosing for herself a Black identity. If the indigenous lands are disappearing, so too are the indigenous ways of life, tied to and dependent upon said ancestral lands, thereby threatening the viability of indigenous tribes. Given her racial ancestry, Ann Plato might look for another community with whom to align herself, and given that national Black leaders devised the strategy of racial uplift as a response blueprint for overcoming racial prejudice in the decade prior to the publication of her book, Plato might have sought refuge in the Black community, and more specifically, the colored Congregational Church. This would mean all vestiges of indigenous belief systems would have to be abandoned, and Ann Plato's wholehearted adoption of Christianity would become necessary. Reverend Pennington's assessment of Ann Plato's character suggests that she carried herself as a pious Christian young woman. Pennington writes in Essay's introduction, "I know of nothing more praiseworthy than to see one of such promise come before the public with the religion of Christ uppermost in her mind." Subsequently, Essays begins with a rapturous didactic essay entitled Religion. Its position sets the tone for the larger work. Moreover, it assures the reader of the author's devout belief in Christianity, satisfying the prevailing social expectation, thereby lending Plato needed credibility. Even so, there is a subtext in this passage that insinuates equity among true Christians, asserts that all brutish behavior is unchristian, and challenges the sovereignty of earthly authority. Plato writes, "Religion is the daughter of heaven, parent of our virtues, and source of all true felicity. She alone giveth peace and contentment, divests the heart of anxious cares, bursts on the mind a flood of joy, and sheds unmingled and preternatural sunshine in the pious breast. By her, the spirits of darkness are banished from the earth, and angelic ministers of grace thicken, unseen, the regions of mortality. She promotes love and goodwill among men, lifts the head that hangs down, heals the wounded spirit, dissipates the gloom of sorrow, sweetens the cup of affliction, blunts the sting of death, and whatever seen, felt, and enjoyed breathes around her an everlasting spring. Religion raises men above themselves. Irreligion sinks them beneath the brutes." Plato's use of the descriptors Christianity and religion interchangeably implies that there is only one true religion, which is Christianity. Moreover, by casting religion as the daughter of heaven, Plato associates Christianity with the cult of true womanhood. Thus, Christianity is to be adored and protected, and she, Christianity, embodies and bestows all cardinal virtues. And she, Christianity, is the source of all true happiness and supplants all earthly systems and power structures. This thinking suggests equity between believers. Each owes allegiance first to religion. Acquisitions outside of the tenets of Christianity are void of virtue. These precepts are both aspirational and admonitory. Believers of color, through faith, can achieve high moral standards that can afford them admiration and access here on earth, at least amongst fellow believers. White believers are responsible for accepting into their privileged spaces their colored Christian brethren. Those who do not are deemed brutish and unchristian. Understanding that brutish forces will remain on earth, Plato offers the believer solace, instructing them to take courage during troubled times and have hope in an everlasting life, devoid of sorrow. Few avowed Christians would find fault with the thesis of Plato's essay. Religion, and many readers might consider Ann Plato to be pious, as Reverend Pennington did. We'll just skip ahead here. In her essay entitled Education, Plato tethers religious piety to the acquisition of knowledge. This is an important connection that Plato continues through her work. Otherwise, education might seem an unnecessary and vain pursuit for a young woman of color. However, Plato insists that if one is to convert to Christianity, one must have access to the texts that set the standard. She contends a good education is that which prepares us for our future sphere of action and makes us contented with that situation in life in which God, in his infinite mercy, has seen fit to place us. To be perfectly resigned to our lot in life, whatever it may be. Religion has been decreed as the passion of weak persons, but the Bible tells us to seek first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness, and all other things shall be added unto us. This world is only a place to prepare for another and a better. If it were not for education, how would our heathen be taught therefrom? Plato seems to say that religion teaches humility, contentment, and subsequent submission to the social order, all of which appear to protect the status quo, while suggesting a potential society burgeoning with enlightened citizens. Additionally, Plato's call for religious training for all citizens could temper aversion to the education of people of color, as proselytizing is every Christian's duty. Plato waxes on about the true wealth of a nation being tied to the level of education afforded its people, offering this comparison: in proportion to the education of a nation, it is rich and powerful. To behold the wealth and power of Great Britain and compare it with China, America with Mexico, how confused are the ideas of the latter, how narrow their conceptions, and are, as it were, an unknown world. These patriotic articulations prime the reader for Plato's implicit ask of the Christian power structure: to educate all members of the population, as the well-being of the nation is tied to the well-being of the least of its citizens. While openly, Essays is an instruction book for young colored girls, Plato is aware of the white gaze and the power of subtext. However, she is mindful to couch her contentions in pious and patriotic discourse that will afford her access to safe spaces. Plato's address of education is not only relegated to the aforementioned essay. Essays itself is a demonstration of the ability of the marginalized to not only learn perfunctory applications, but to master elevated language, contextualize philosophical and religious texts, thereby demonstrating comprehension of complex ideas and postulates. This counters those 19th century scientists like Harvard's Louis Agassiz, who posited that human races were distinct species, and supported his theory with pseudoscientific methods like craniometry, the measurement of human skulls, which supposedly proved that white people were biologically superior to blacks, thus making their extinction inevitable. It is against this backdrop that Ann Plato, a young colored woman, writes her book. In doing so, she not only joins a small cohort of Black thinkers, but she also challenges the larger community of her time to broaden their expectations of persons of color and of her own ability specifically. This is not to say that Essays was met with critical praise in Plato's time or even subsequently. Wellborn writes, 7 years after its publication, the editor of the Knickerbocker or the New York Monthly Magazine gave it a snarky and condescending appraisal in the editor's table section, although he did find some things he liked. He opens with, "We have laughed in some degree over this little volume sent us by a friend in Hartford." Not only does the editor take aim at Ann Plato, but he also levels his critical eye at Reverend Pennington, pronouncing his preface as only less original and sparkling than the contents of the volume itself. However, the editor's most notable complaint, which critics of color have also leveled, is that Essays is derivative. As the editor assesses Plato's prose, a compound of her own imaginations into fragments of various moral essays and advices of Mrs. Sigourney. Undoubtedly, Plato used Lydia Sigourney's letter to young ladies by a lady and the girls' reading book as templates. However, this is not mere imitation. Instead, Plato is availing herself of the tradition of literary echo and allusion through which juxtaposition of texts place them in conversation. This conversation creates a third literary space where readers and scholars can find confluences and contradictions. For instance, the reader must consider the authors as individuals, their ranking in the social construct of their time and place, both of which will impact the reception of said texts. Readers must also consider the author's intended and unintended audiences. Per the preface that precedes Sigourney's moral essays and advice, she was requested to address a few thoughts to the youth of her sex on subjects of simple nature and serious concern. To further establish her authority and fitness for the challenge, Sigourney cites her experience as a teacher. She writes, "The employment has been pleasant, for their interests are dear to me, and several years devoted to their instruction have unfolded more fully their claims to regard and the influence they might exercise in society." And additionally, she came to be known as the sweet singer of Hartford and has an established pedigree to endorse her. Poetry Foundation notes she attended private school with the assistance of her father's employer and founded a Hartford school for girls in 1814. Additionally, her husband encouraged her to devote her time to writing, and Sigourney quickly found success and published over dozens of volumes of poetry and essay. So the audience for her book, Letter to Young Ladies by a Lady, is a young white woman capable of engaging herself with domestic employment, enjoying recreational exercise, and providing relief to the poor and afflicted. And this young white woman would be well off enough to concern herself with whether her dress infringes upon her delicacy. Given what is known of Ann Plato, she is without this privilege and subsequent agency. However, Plato is not without aspirations. Plato aspires to be a teacher. She aspires to participate in the uplift of young colored girls. Therefore, Plato employs Sigourney as a type of mentor at large, much in the way that Sigourney herself employs Mary Wollstonecraft, noted women's rights activist and author of A Vindication of Rights of Women. Wellborn explains, Plato avoids imitation of Sigourney's ideas and thoroughgoing exactness of rhetorical execution, yet she borrows in an act of intertextual mentorship, following a practice of 18th and 19th century prose and verse poetics. The influence of Mary Wollstonecraft on 19th century women thinkers and authors in England and the United States can be seen in the aforementioned Sigourney books, in particular Wollstonecraft's writings on the education of young women. So subsequently, Plato places her work in conversation with both Sigourney's and Wollstonecraft, each writer advocating for the education and agency for young women in varying degrees. What is most bold about essays is that Plato dares to interject herself into these spaces. She adeptly writes in the tradition of famed women writers and dares to assume that there is a market for such a book and that young women of color will avail themselves of the knowledge therein. Plato's essays diverges from Letters to a Young Lady by a Lady significantly. While Sigourney's tone is cheerful and admonishes young women to maintain a cheerful demeanor and modulate their speech and behavior accordingly, Plato's tone is somber and contemplative. Wellborn notes that Sigourney believed that cheerfulness is expected of the young. It is the natural temperament of life's brightest season. However, with essays, Plato, youthful and religiously impressionable, offered a contrast through her earnest literary countenance and the fatalistic orientation of her vision. The reader might ascribe this to Plato's racial identity as a native woman watching her father's people vanishing, and abolitionists fighting the plague of slavery. Given the peril of living as a young indigenous and black woman without a male covering, as others enjoyed, Plato seemingly relied on religion as the promise of heaven as her hope and light. This religious bent seems more practical for young colored girls who live in Plato's world and allows her to remain openly apolitical. Wellborn notes that Plato, eschewing in her book Political Consciousness and Social Status for Religion's Moral Code of Conduct, Plato demonstrates as much social consciousness as the religious life offers anyone. Wellborn explains a small critical mass of families of color did subscribe to codes of conduct that would enhance their image among fellows and for their benefit in the dominant society. Subsequently, essays can be read as Plato's own book of conduct, whose principles would prepare her to join the middle class when she became a teacher. Ultimately, records confirm Miss Ann Plato's teaching career. The Common School report printed in the supplement to the Connecticut Current in March 1845 acknowledged 3 years of teaching. She is later confirmed to have taught at the Elm Street School for 2 years. Whether Plato's publication of essays and her association with the colored Congregational Church and Reverend Pennington helped her to achieve that end is speculative. However, the contents of essays, including biographies and miscellaneous pieces in poetry and prose and poetry, is a peek into Plato's process. Born in indigenous and Black and problematic times without pious and affectionate parents, Plato fashions an identity for herself in keeping with the social mores of her time. She is wise enough to remain moderate and not bring unfavorable notice to herself. And though her activism is demonstrated quietly, the education of young women of color is activist enough. Plato judges the world around her accurately and discerns that indigenous associations are unsustainable, and she sets herself on a path to the middle class through connections with Reverend Pennington and the colored Congregational Church. Without husband or father, Plato sets out on her own, choosing for herself a profession that would prosper a lady and would allow a lady to sustain herself. Nothing is known about Plato's life from the time that she finishes teaching until she arguably shows up in the Iowa federal census of 1870, characterized as a foreign white woman. But it would seem that the all but orphaned child made a way for herself and ultimately crossed over into a more protected identity construct, that of an educated white woman. Thank you.
Antoinette has graciously agreed to field our questions tonight, so if you're here in the room and you have a question, please raise your hand so we can bring this mic to you so that everyone can hear it and people listening online can hear it. And if you are online, just a reminder, please type your question in the chat and we will relay that to Antoinette. Any questions?
There, I would say, obviously, are no pictures of her portraits. How did she pass as a white woman in the end?
Well, what we do know is that she was of mixed heritage. So she was part Indian. She was also part Black or African American. We do not know the complexion of her mother, or if her mother herself was also a biracial person. And so subsequently, it seems, according to some scholars, that they do believe that she gets picked up in the census much later on. It's interesting that she's just not flat out passing. It would seem that she's a foreign woman, which would allow for more, I guess, exotic look. But given the way that she could speak and her level of education, it could very well be that she did choose to pass.
Where did she end up again?
In Iowa.
How did she get from here to there?
There's a lot of speculation about that. For the number of years in which she's missing and we don't really know much about her, there was a terrible epidemic of consumption, tuberculosis. Some people speculate that for that time she might have been convalescing. Some speculate she might have gone into private service and was a governess. But if you want to reinvent yourself, then definitely you will have to leave the areas in which you are known. But by that time, she would have had teaching credentials, and she would also be a little bit older.
Hello.
In your analysis of her text, specifically the one that you identified as having an audience of the black social class in the area, in that era, did you find anything that was explicitly directed towards black people or anything that talked about black womanhood in an era?
We're talking about in her text?
In her text, yes.
Her text is dedicated to young colored girls. And so, as I mentioned early on, she was kind of forgotten in the sense that she wasn't very verbose with her activism, right? She wasn't maybe as demonstrative as, say, Phyllis Wheatley or Pennington or any other people of her time. And so, that's a lot of the criticism that's leveled against her. But when she actually sits down to write a book and demonstrate, by virtue of actually being able to write this book, that she, an Indigenous and black woman, could avail herself of education, could write, could think on higher levels. She's also offering to young black girls this opportunity to do exactly what she's done. So I think that answers your question. Did I find anything that she did specifically for black people? I would say the book itself is specifically for black people.
My second question is, in the context of the book, or in the content of the book, are there any addendums or references made to her character that we see, like also in the autobiographies of enslaved people? Because it's like, I assume it's a self-published work, the essays.
It is thought that Reverend Pennington paid or offered some type of financial support, but we don't know anything more than that. And in terms of enslavement and the Indigenous, she does make reference to that, but basically her book is to young women how to live and breathe and navigate this world that is not necessarily welcoming of you. So she's basically saying, this is what you're going to have to put on. I guess it's equivalent to the talk that many African American families have with their sons, as they reach a certain age. This is how you need to carry yourself in order to be able to navigate this world more safely.
It's my understanding that Reverend Pennington was very impressed with her writings, and he encouraged her to write everything down, and he had the book published and wrote the introduction. And for anyone who's really interested, you can read it free on PDF. Also, could you mention also the part where Trinity College has a fellowship in her name?
I'm from Capital, so I don't really know much about what Trinity has going on. I do know they have a lecture series, I do believe, that is in her name, as do some other colleges around the country, but I don't know anything specifically about Trinity.
I'm sorry to take up so much time, but I've been teaching about her and Reverend Pennington, Jim Pembroke, Augustus Washington, Rebecca Primus, Jim Mars, for 12 years. And a lot of my students, they say, well, what did she look like? And I say, nobody knows.
Yeah.
I show them sketches of Pennington and, pictures of Jim Mars, but I tell them cameras weren't invented yet. Use your imagination.
Yeah, I've looked and looked and looked, and I can't find any even description of her physicality.
We have a question from somebody watching online. Mariana's going to relate that.
All right, we have a question here from Thomas Brim on YouTube. He asks, how would Ann Plato's type of activism/work play out today?
I think that it would be very much the same, in the sense that she would instruct young women how to make their way in the world. And I think she would have much more agency now, right, than she did then. I think she would be telling women to become educated, to make your own money. She took care of herself at a time where it was almost necessary for you to have a male covering if you didn't have a husband, and if your father had passed on, it was your brother's responsibility to take care of you. And still she found a profession by which she could still be a proper woman, right? A socially acceptable young spinster or older, spinster, and she would be able to still provide for herself without anyone raising an eyebrow or questioning her. So an old spinsterly teacher was quite appropriate. And she looked around and she found a way to take care of herself. And I think that's what her activism would look like. She really believed in education. She wrote extensively about how important it was to be educated, not just so that you could read the Bible, of course so that you could read the Bible, but also so that you could read the history of the nations of the world, understand civilization, understand philosophy, to be able to participate in a larger conversation. I think she would be absolutely thrilled that a black woman would have a mic in such a prestigious, establishment and have people actually listen to her. I think, kind of quoting a Maya Angelou poem, I think this would be her wildest dream. Yeah.
Antoinette, you mentioned her being a teacher. Do you have any specifics on that, whether it was in homes or did she sort of form a private school, or do we have any details on that?
She actually taught in 2 established schools that showed up in the census. So that's how we know that she was actually a teacher for at least 5 years that we can account for in 2 well-established schools. So she did finish teaching college. We do also have, proof of that. She did go to teaching school, she did graduate, she did have credentials, and she did hold 2 positions in Hartford for a total of 5 years teaching that we can track.
Antoinette, you mentioned in your talk 2 publications that criticized or had commentary about. Can you tell us about those publications and their relevance to the era?
Well, I think it's really interesting. We get that little piece from a magazine in New York that says, "We quite laughed, at this little volume." And I think that they were looking at her work in terms of, this is a young woman, because she's like, 15 when she writes this, a young woman, a black and indigenous woman, and it's like, oh, isn't that a cute, sweet little effort? The other thing is that because she closely followed the template of Lydia Sigourney's work, they kind of wanted to say that it was derivative. But as I talk about in my essay, she's doing what was considered the proper literary thing to do at the time. It was okay for you to be in conversation with another book, but get a load of this, you had to be bettering it. And if that's not activist, I don't know what is. To come and stand in the space with 2 very well-known women writers of the time and say, I have a right to be in conversation, and I have a right to take your work, which does not apply to people like me, and turn it into something that is usable for us. And I thought, wow, that's a bold, bold step at that particular time.
Hi, I really appreciate how you're shining a light on Ann Plato tonight. This is really wonderful.
Thank
and
you.
Somebody had just asked about the school, and there is a little piece in the Connecticut Current from, I don't have the year here, of course, but it describes the second colored school in Hartford, and it talks about the furniture, the accommodations in this school are miserable. And then it goes to the teacher. The school has been for about a year under the care of Miss Ann Plato, has been teaching in all 3 years, salary $120.
Wow.
And it goes on to explain the books, the classes, the pupils, whole number 47, average attendance, boys 17, girls 20, between the ages of 4 and 10, about 25, between 10 and 16, about 22, deportment, good.
Wonderful. So this is from the census.
This is from the Connecticut Current. It's
From
the
the
Common
Current.
School Report, and March 4th, 1845.
Oh my goodness, I would love to look at that. I
I'll
haven't
send that
seen
to
that.
you.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you. This essay will keep evolving and evolving.
I'm relatively new to Hartford, but I've done a little bit of research into a family that arrived in Hartford in 1637. But I wondered if you have any information from the 1860 census, because in 1855, the railroad reached the Quad Cities on the Mississippi River between Illinois and Iowa. So after 1855, she would have been able to get out here. That's why I was wondering about the 1860 census, because perhaps she was here, and of course in 1862 was the Emancipation Proclamation, and then you get a question as to whether or not that she felt liberated to travel after that.
You bring up a really good point. Scholars have not been able to find any trace of her until Iowa. They've exhausted, the resources that they have found available, but that's a really interesting possibility that I will look into as well. That might be exactly how she gets to Iowa.
I have a question of my own. Antoinette, how did you learn about Anne? How did you discover Anne?
This is a really good question, because I've been teaching, pretty soon it'll be 20 years, and I knew nothing of Ann Plato until the Hartford Heritage Project and Dr. Jeff Partridge decided to start the Black Heritage Project. And when we were thinking about what all of the things that we would like to research, her name was on there. And I said, who is this and why don't I know her? Which sent me on, I guess 18 months of journey, just reading everything that I could read about. Of course, there's not a lot about her. So most of my conjecture comes from who she is as a writer, but then also learning what Hartford was like, and learning who was here, and learning the politics, and then learning about, religion and how it evolved, and, the first, the second awakening, all of these types of things, and then coming to realize that this was a very, very intelligent and well thought out young woman to be, pretty much on your own since you're about 10 or so, and then having to work. We do know that that she she availed herself of education. There was some help there, people giving her books, and where it's thought that her employer's daughter took a liking to her and did a lot of teaching. But like I always say to my students, I can throw a $100 bill on the ground, but you still have to bend over and pick it up. And she was really reading and studying in between mopping and all whatever else that she was doing. And so I was just fascinated with her, And then I guess when I did find some things and people didn't seem to give her much credence or much thought, I felt like, you know what, I think they're missing the point. The point is, she could have just been some street kid and could have passed, through life and no one would have ever heard of her. But she was smart enough to look around her and say, how am I going to navigate this world? How am I going to provide and protect myself when the people that I expected to take care of me, my mother and father, are not here to do that, right? And she made a way for herself out of no way at all. And, whether or not you agree with, the conjecture that she ends up passing, the point of the matter is that she was able to survive in a very inhospitable environment. And for that alone, I'm in awe.
Hello, can you hear me? I can't hear myself. That's what I'm like. Were you able to? There I am. Compare Ann Plato's life to Maria W. Stewart's life and her voice as a writer in that era?
I looked at Ann Plato just at herself, right? I wanted to know how she survived, and I wanted to figure out, what brought her to write in the manner that she did, and why she took on the covering of Christianity and held that cloak so tightly. Because for her, it was a type of covering, and it helped her to pass into respectability, because that was the social mores at the time. And then from there, it afforded her a pathway through giving her greater social mobility. So I didn't compare her to anyone or juxtapose her with anyone other than, Lydia Sigourney and Wallingstone, because she was in because her work is directly in conversation with their work.
Other questions? Antoinette?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.